I came home from a 14-month deployment in Afghanistan to find a stranger living in my cabin, and she had the audacity to threaten me with a restraining order when I walked through my own front door. My name is Lucas Warner, and I spent the better part of my adult life serving in the United States Army Special Forces. I'd just completed what I hoped would be my final overseas deployment, and all I wanted was to get back to my property in the mountains outside Asheville, North Carolina. The cabin wasn't much, just a modest 2-bedroom place I had bought 5 years ago with my combat pay, but it sat on 3 acres of pristine forest land and represented everything I had worked for. It was supposed to be my sanctuary, the place where I could decompress from the things I had seen and done in service to my country. The drive from Fort Bragg took about 4 hours, and I spent most of it imagining the peace and quiet I would finally have. No more explosions, no more constant vigilance, no more sleeping with one eye open. Just me, the woods, and maybe some fishing in the stream that ran through the eastern edge of my property. I had turned off my phone for most of the deployment to maintain operational security, only checking in with my family occasionally through secure military channels. My younger brother knew I was coming home, but I had told him not to make a fuss. I just wanted to slip back into civilian life quietly. The sun was setting behind the mountains when I turned onto the private road that led to my cabin. The forest was thick with oak and pine, and the air smelled like earth and rain. I rolled down the window of my beat-up Ford truck and breathed it in, feeling something inside my chest finally start to unclench. This was home. This was where I belonged. Then I saw the signs. They were posted every 50 feet along the road, bright white signs with blue lettering that read, "Mountain View Estates HOA property and residents only beyond this point." My stomach dropped. When I had bought this land, there was no HOA. The whole reason I had chosen this location was because it was unincorporated county land, no restrictions, no rules, just freedom. I had specifically asked my real estate agent about it, and she had assured me there were no homeowners associations within 10 miles. I kept driving, hoping it was some kind of mistake, but the signs continued all the way to my driveway. And that's when things got really strange. My driveway, which had been a simple gravel path, was now paved with fresh asphalt. There were decorative lights lining both sides, and at the end of that driveway, sitting in front of my cabin, was a silver Lexus SUV that definitely did not belong to me. I parked my truck and sat there for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. The cabin looked different too. The exterior had been repainted from the natural wood stain I had chosen to a pale blue color with white trim. There were flower boxes under the windows that I had never installed. A new welcome mat sat in front of the door, one of those cutesy ones that said "Blessed" in cursive script. I got out of the truck slowly, every instinct I had developed over years of combat operations telling me something was very wrong. I was still wearing my Army combat uniform because I had left straight from base, and my duffel bag in the truck bed contained pretty much everything I owned. I walked up to the front door and tried the handle. Locked. With a lock I did not recognize, I knocked firmly but not aggressively. I heard footsteps inside. Then the door swung open to reveal a woman in her late 40s with an elaborate blonde hairstyle and enough jewelry to stock a department store display case. She was wearing what I can only describe as country club casual, all pastels and designer labels. Her face went from annoyed to shocked to outraged in about 3 seconds. "What do you think you are doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "I live here," I said, keeping my voice calm and level. "Who are you, and why are you in my house?" Her eyes narrowed, and she looked me up and down like I was something unpleasant she had found on the bottom of her shoe. "This is my house. I purchased it 6 months ago through the HOA foreclosure process. If you do not leave immediately, I will call the police." I felt that combat calm settle over me, the one that kicks in when situations go sideways. "Madam, my name is Lucas Warner. I purchased this property in 2020, and I have the deed to prove it. I have been deployed overseas with the military for the past 14 months. Now, I'm going to ask you again. Who are you and why are you in my house?" She pulled out her phone, her manicured nails flashing. "I am calling the police right now. I am Brenda Whitmore, president of the Mountain View Estates HOA, and you are trespassing on my property. Go ahead and call them, I said. I would very much like to hear how you think you own my house. She did call them, speaking in that breathless, frightened tone that certain people can summon on command. Yes, there is a strange man at my door claiming to live here. He is wearing military clothes, but I think he might be stolen valor. Please hurry, I'm so scared. She hung up and crossed her arms, a satisfied expression on her face. The police will be here in 10 minutes. You should leave before they arrive and arrest you. I will wait, I said. I walked back to my truck and leaned against it, watching Brenda hover nervously in the doorway. She kept looking at me like I might charge the house at any moment, which was almost funny given the circumstances. The Henderson County Sheriff's deputy arrived in 8 minutes, a young guy who looked fresh out of the academy. He got out of his patrol car with his hand near his weapon, clearly responding to a potentially dangerous call. "Sir, can you step away from the vehicle with your hands visible?" he called out. I complied immediately, putting my hands out to my sides. "Deputy, my name is Staff Sergeant Lucas Warner, United States Army Special Forces. That woman in the doorway is occupying my home without my permission. I can provide military ID and property documentation." The deputy looked between me and Brenda, clearly trying to figure out what was going on. "Madam, can you come out here, please?" Brenda emerged from the house, clutching a folder to her chest like a shield. "Officer, thank goodness you are here. This man is trying to steal my house. I have all the paperwork right here, showing that I legally own this property. And I have my deed and military orders showing I have been deployed overseas," I said. "The last time I was in this house was March of last year, right before I shipped out to Afghanistan." The deputy held up his hands. "Okay, let's everybody stay calm. This sounds like a civil matter, not a criminal one. Sir, do you have identification?" I slowly reached for my wallet and pulled out my military ID and driver's license. The deputy examined them carefully, then looked at the address on my license. It matched the cabin's address. "Madam, can I see your paperwork?" he asked Brenda. She handed over the folder with a triumphant expression. The deputy flipped through the pages, his frown deepening. "This says the property was foreclosed on for non-payment of HOA dues and fees totaling $17,000. It says notices were sent to this address and were not responded to." "I was deployed in Afghanistan," I said, forcing myself to stay calm. "I had no way to receive mail here, and when I bought this property, there was no HOA. I specifically purchased here to avoid that." The deputy looked uncomfortable. "Look, this is way above my pay grade. You both seem to have paperwork claiming ownership. I cannot just remove someone from a house based on competing claims. You're going to need to get lawyers involved and sort this out in court." "So she just gets to stay in my house?" I asked, disbelief creeping into my voice. "Until a judge says otherwise, I cannot forcibly remove her if she has paperwork claiming legal ownership, even if that paperwork might be invalid. I am sorry, sir, and thank you for your service, but this is a civil property dispute." Brenda's smile was absolutely venomous. "You heard the officer. Leave my property immediately or I will pursue a restraining order." I wanted to argue, wanted to explain all the reasons this was insane, but I knew the deputy was just doing his job. The system does not work fast, especially when property law gets involved. "Fine," I said, "but I will be back with a lawyer and we will sort this out." I got in my truck and drove back down the mountain, my mind racing. I found a cheap motel in Asheville and checked in for the night, then spent the next 3 hours on my laptop trying to piece together what had happened. Using the public record search, I discovered that while I was overseas, a group of property owners in the area had formed something called the Mountain View Estates HOA. They had filed papers claiming jurisdiction over a large swath of mountain land that included my property. The documentation was technically legal, but there was a problem. Under North Carolina law, HOAs can only be formed if property owners are properly notified and given a chance to opt in or object. The notices had apparently been sent to property addresses, not to property owners' mailing addresses of record with the county. For someone like me, who was deployed overseas with mail forwarding to a military APO address, those notices might as well have been sent to Mars. Then, according to the foreclosure documents I found, the HOA had begun assessing dues and fees retroactively. When I did not pay because I never received the notices, they assessed penalties and interest. After 6 months, they had foreclosed on the property and sold it at an HOA auction. Brenda had purchased it for $30,000, about a third of what it was actually worth. I had seen some shady operations in my time, but this was something else. This was a scheme designed to steal property from people who could not defend themselves. And I was willing to bet I was not the only one it had happened to. The next morning, I called every lawyer in Asheville who practiced property law. The first 4 told me they could not take my case because they already represented the Mountain View Estates HOA. The 5th lawyer, a woman named Patricia Hughes, agreed to meet with me that afternoon. Patricia's office was in a converted house downtown, all hardwood floors and mismatched furniture that somehow looked professional anyway. She was in her 60s with gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and sharp eyes that assessed me the moment I walked in. "Staff Sergeant Warner," she said, shaking my hand firmly. "Tell me everything." I did, starting from when I bought the property and ending with my confrontation with Brenda the night before. Patricia took notes on a legal pad, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and tapped her pen against her lips. "This stinks to high heaven," she said bluntly. "I have heard rumors about Mountain View Estates. They have been aggressive, to put it mildly. But this is the first time I have heard of them targeting a deployed service member. That is going to be a problem for them." "What do you mean?" I asked. "The Service Members Civil Relief Act," she explained. "It is a federal law that provides protections for active duty military members in civil proceedings. One of those protections is that you cannot have a default judgment entered against you while you are deployed unless the court appoints an attorney to represent your interests. An HOA foreclosure is a default proceeding. If they foreclosed while you were deployed without proper notification and without the court appointing representation for you, that foreclosure is void." Hope flickered in my chest for the first time since I had come home. "So I can get my house back?" "Potentially, yes. But it is going to be a fight. I will need to file an emergency motion to set aside the foreclosure and request immediate possession of the property be returned to you. We will also need to file a lawsuit against the HOA for wrongful foreclosure and possibly fraud. This Brenda person who bought your house is going to fight us because she paid money for it, even if that sale was invalid." "How much is this going to cost me?" I asked, dreading the answer. Patricia named a retainer fee that made me wince, but it was not completely out of reach. I had saved most of my deployment pay because there was nothing to spend it on in Afghanistan. "I can do that. When can we start?" "I will draft the emergency motion today and file it first thing tomorrow morning. In the meantime, do not go back to the property. I know it is your house, but if you have any confrontation with this Brenda woman, it will only complicate things. Let me handle this through the courts." I agreed, even though every instinct I had was telling me to go back up that mountain and physically remove Brenda from my cabin. But I'd spent enough time in the military to understand the importance of following procedure and trusting the chain of command. Patricia was my legal counsel now, so I would follow her lead. The next few days were some of the hardest of my life. I stayed at that cheap motel, watching my savings drain away while I waited for the legal system to move. Patricia filed the emergency motion, and we got a hearing date for the following week. In the meantime, I drove back up to my property just to look at it from the road. I did not approach the cabin, but I could see Brenda moving around inside through the windows. At one point, she came out and waved at someone across the way, laughing like she did not have a care in the world. It took everything I had not to confront her. I also started asking questions around the area. There was a small general store about 2 miles from my property, and I stopped in there to buy supplies and chat with the owner, an older man named Frank, who had lived in these mountains his whole life. "You're asking about the HOA?" Frank said, leaning against the counter. "Yeah, they have been a nightmare. Came in about 2 years ago, started filing papers and claiming all sorts of jurisdiction. A lot of folks around here are mad about it, but what can you do? They have lawyers." "Do you know of anyone else who lost property to them?" I asked. Frank's expression darkened. "My nephew. He was working on an oil rig in the Gulf when they foreclosed on his hunting cabin. By the time he got back and figured out what happened, someone else was living in it. He could not afford a lawyer to fight it, so he just walked away. Lost 40 acres his grandfather left him." That's terrible, I said, feeling my anger build. Who is running this HOA, besides Brenda Whitmore? Her husband, Paul Whitmore. He is the one who set it all up. Moved here from Florida about 3 years back. Bought up a bunch of cheap land, then created the HOA and started annexing neighboring properties into it. The whole thing is a racket if you ask me, but it is all technically legal according to the county. I filed that information away. If this was a pattern, if the Whitmores were systematically stealing property through HOA foreclosures, then maybe this was not just a civil case. Maybe it was fraud on a scale that would interest law enforcement. The hearing finally arrived on a Tuesday morning. I put on the only civilian suit I owned and met Patricia at the Henderson County Courthouse. Brenda was there with her lawyer, a slick-looking guy in an expensive suit who kept checking his Rolex. Brenda glared at me across the courtroom like I was personally ruining her life. The judge was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s named Judge Carolyn Morrison. She listened to Patricia's argument about the Service Members Civil Relief Act violations, then turned to Brenda's lawyer. Counsel, did your client or the HOA verify whether Staff Sergeant Warner was on active duty before proceeding with the foreclosure? Judge Morrison asked. Your Honor, notices were properly sent to the property address according to HOA bylaws, the lawyer said smoothly. We followed all required procedures. That was not my question, the judge said sharply. Did you verify his military status? The lawyer hesitated. We were not aware of any requirement to do so. Judge Morrison looked at him like he had just admitted to not knowing the law. The Service Members Civil Relief Act is federal law, counsel. It has been in effect since 1940 in various forms. If you are practicing law that involves potential default judgments, you should be aware of it. She turned to Patricia. Do you have proof of your client's deployment status? Patricia handed over a stack of documents including my military orders, deployment records, and a letter from my commanding officer confirming I had been in Afghanistan during the entire foreclosure process with limited access to mail and no access to civilian legal proceedings. Judge Morrison reviewed the documents carefully, then looked up at Brenda's lawyer. The foreclosure is void. Staff Sergeant Warner was deployed and entitled to protections under federal law that were not provided. The sale to Mrs. Whitmore is therefore invalid. Brenda shot to her feet. This is not fair. I paid good money for that house. You cannot just take it away from me. Mrs. Whitmore, sit down, Judge Morrison said firmly. You may have paid money, but you purchased property through an invalid foreclosure. You will need to seek reimbursement from the HOA that sold it to you. Staff Sergeant Warner is entitled to immediate possession of his property. I am issuing an order right now, requiring you to vacate within 72 hours and return the property in the condition it was in when you took possession. That is impossible, Brenda shrieked. I have made improvements. I have spent money. That is between you and the HOA, the judge said. Bailiff, please escort Mrs. Whitmore out if she cannot control herself. Brenda's lawyer pulled her back into her seat, whispering urgently in her ear. Judge Morrison signed the order and handed it to Patricia. Staff Sergeant Warner, I apologize that you had to go through this after serving our country. I hope this matter is resolved quickly so you can finally come home. Thank you, Your Honor, I said, feeling a wave of relief so strong it almost knocked me over. We left the courtroom with the order in hand. Brenda and her lawyer were arguing in heated whispers near the exit. As I walked past, Brenda grabbed my arm. This is not over, she hissed. My husband is going to make sure you regret this. I gently removed her hand from my arm. Madam, I suggest you spend the next 72 hours packing your belongings and finding somewhere else to live. If you are not out by Friday, I will have the sheriff remove you. Her face went red with rage, but her lawyer pulled her away before she could say anything else. Patricia and I walked outside into the sunshine. That went as well as I could have hoped, Patricia said, but she was right about one thing. This probably is not over. The HOA is going to come after you for those alleged dues and fees. Let them try, I said. I never agreed to join their HOA, and they have no legal authority over my property. I agree, but we will need to make that case in court. In the meantime, I suggest you document everything when you retake possession of the property. Take photos, videos, make notes of any damage or changes. We will need that evidence. I thanked Patricia and drove straight back up the mountain. The 72 hours felt like the longest 3 days of my life, but I spent them productively. I contacted several other property owners in the area who Frank had mentioned might have been affected by the HOA's practices. I found 5 people who had similar stories, people who had lost property or been forced to pay thousands of dollars in questionable fees. One of them was a woman named Sarah, who had lost her parents' land while she was dealing with her mother's cancer treatments. She had been so overwhelmed with medical decisions that she had not realized what was happening until the foreclosure was complete. Another was a retired veteran like me who had been working overseas as a contractor when the HOA came after his property. He had managed to keep it by paying $15,000 in fees that he could not afford, money that had wiped out his retirement savings. I documented all of their stories, recorded interviews, and collected whatever paperwork they had. If this was fraud, I wanted to have evidence to present to law enforcement. Friday morning arrived, and I drove up to my cabin with Patricia following in her car. We had agreed she should be present in case there were any issues. When we pulled up, I was relieved to see the Lexus was gone and the cabin looked empty. I used the copy of Judge Morrison's order to show the locksmith I had hired that I had legal right to the property, and he changed all the locks while Patricia and I did a walkthrough. The inside of my cabin was barely recognizable. Brenda had redecorated everything in that same country club style, all pastels and fake rustic charm. My furniture was gone, replaced with expensive-looking pieces that probably cost more than my truck. The walls were covered in those generic inspirational signs about living, laughing, and loving. My blood pressure rose with every room we entered, but what really made me angry was what I found in my bedroom. My closet, where I had stored military memorabilia, family photos, and personal items that I had not wanted to take overseas, was empty. The boxes were gone. Everything I had left behind was just gone. "Where is my stuff?" I said to Patricia, fighting to keep my voice level. She was taking photos of the room. "That's a very good question. Make a list of everything that is missing. If she disposed of your property, that is conversion and possibly theft, we can add it to the lawsuit." I found a storage unit receipt in the trash, half buried under takeout containers. It was from a facility in Asheville, rented in Brenda's name. At least she had not thrown everything away, even if she had no right to touch it in the first place. We finished documenting the property, and Patricia left to start drafting an expanded lawsuit that would include not just wrongful foreclosure, but also conversion of property, violations of the Service Member Civil Relief Act, and potential fraud claims against both Brenda and the HOA itself. I was finally home, but it did not feel like home. I spent the weekend removing all of Brenda's decorations and furniture, stacking them in the garage for her to collect. I drove to the storage unit and retrieved my belongings, relieved to find everything was there, just packed carelessly in boxes. Slowly, I started to reclaim my space. On Monday morning, I got a knock on my door. It was a process server with a thick envelope. Inside was a lawsuit from the Mountain View Estates HOA, claiming I owed $17,000 in back dues, fees, penalties, and interest. There was also a demand that I comply with HOA architectural guidelines by repainting my cabin back to the blue color Brenda had chosen, as the natural wood stain I preferred was apparently not approved. I called Patricia immediately. She sighed when I read her the papers. "They are doubling down," she said. "They think they can intimidate you into just paying. Forward everything to me. We will respond by adding the HOA as a defendant in our lawsuit and countersuing for harassment and abuse of process. But Lucas, I need to tell you something. The amount they are asking for, the aggressive tactics, the fact that they are coming after you even after losing in court, this suggests they are either very confident in their position or they are desperate. Neither scenario is good for us." "What do you mean?" "I mean, either they have some legal theory we have not considered, or they are in financial trouble and need to extract money from property owners to stay afloat. If it is the latter, we might be dealing with something bigger than just a bad HOA. We might be dealing with a fraud scheme." That matched what I had been thinking. I have been talking to other people they have targeted. There is a pattern here. They go after people who are vulnerable, people who are away or dealing with crises, people who cannot fight back. Then they foreclose and either take the property or force people to pay inflated fees. "Have you considered going to law enforcement?" Patricia asked. I was thinking about it. Do you think they would take it seriously? If you have enough evidence, yes, but you would need to present a clear case. I am a civil attorney, not a criminal one, but I can refer you to someone who might be able to help. Let me make some calls. 2 days later, I was sitting in a conference room at the Henderson County District Attorney's office with an assistant DA named Michael Torres. He was younger than I expected, probably in his early 30s, but he had the focused intensity of someone who took his job very seriously. I laid out everything I'd discovered, my case, the other property owners I had talked to, the pattern of targeting vulnerable people, the questionable legal notices, the inflated fees, the foreclosures that happened too quickly to be legitimate. I showed him documents, recordings, timelines. I'd put together a presentation that would have made my military intelligence officers proud. Michael listened to everything without interrupting, taking notes on a legal pad. When I finished, he sat back and looked at the pile of evidence on the table. "This is interesting," he said carefully. "You have certainly identified what looks like a pattern of aggressive HOA practices, but the question is whether those practices cross the line into criminal behavior. Civil disputes, even unfair ones, are not crimes." "What about fraud?" I asked. "They are creating an HOA, claiming authority they do not have, sending notices they know people will not receive, then foreclosing and taking property. How is that not fraud?" "It might be," Michael said, "but I would need to prove intent to defraud, which is a high bar. If they can argue they were just following HOA procedures, even if those procedures are aggressive or unfair, that's a civil matter. Now, if I could prove they deliberately targeted people they knew could not respond, that they falsified documents, that they created the HOA specifically to steal property, that is different." "How do I prove that?" I asked, frustrated. "You probably cannot," Michael said, "but I can. If I open an investigation, I can subpoena documents, interview witnesses under oath, follow the money. The question is whether I have enough to justify opening that investigation. And based on what you have shown me, I think I do." Hope flared again. "So, you will investigate?" "Informally, for now. I will start by requesting documents from the HOA about their formation, their finances, their foreclosure practices. If they refuse to cooperate, or if I find evidence of criminal activity, I will escalate to a formal investigation. But I need to warn you, these things take time. Months, possibly years, and there is no guarantee we will find enough evidence to bring charges." "I understand," I said. "I just want to make sure this does not happen to anyone else." Michael nodded. "I will stay in touch. In the meantime, keep fighting your civil case. Sometimes the best way to expose fraud is through civil discovery. Your attorney can request documents and depositions that might reveal criminal activity. If she finds anything, have her contact me immediately." I left the DA's office feeling like, maybe finally, the system was starting to work. But I also knew Michael was right about the timeline. Justice moved slowly, and I needed to be patient. The civil lawsuit moved forward. Patricia filed our expanded complaint against both Brenda and the HOA, alleging wrongful foreclosure, violations of the Service Member Civil Relief Act, conversion of property, fraud, and abuse of process. We asked for actual damages, punitive damages, and attorney's fees. The numbers we were claiming totaled over $200,000. Brenda and the HOA both hired the same law firm to defend them, which Patricia said was a tactical mistake because it suggested they were coordinating their defense. If they were separate innocent parties, they would have separate interests and separate lawyers. Discovery began, which meant both sides had to turn over documents and answer questions under oath. Patricia requested years of HOA financial records, all foreclosure files, all communications between Brenda and the HOA, and communications between the HOA board members about property acquisition strategies. The HOA fought every request, claiming everything was privileged or confidential. We had to go before Judge Morrison 3 times just to get basic financial records. But when we finally got them, they were revealing. The Mountain View Estates HOA had been formed by Paul Whitmore, Brenda's husband, and 2 other investors. They had purchased several parcels of cheap land in the area, then filed papers creating an HOA and claiming it had jurisdiction over a huge area including dozens of properties they did not own. They had sent notices to property addresses, not to owners, knowing many of the properties were vacation cabins or investment properties where owners did not live full-time. When owners did not respond to notices they never received, the HOA assessed dues, penalties, and interest at inflated rates. Then, they foreclosed quickly before owners realized what was happening. Some of the properties they sold to outside investors, others they kept and rented out. Several they sold to Brenda, always for a fraction of the actual value. Patricia put together a timeline showing that over 3 years, the HOA had foreclosed on 14 properties and collected over $400,000 in fees from property owners who paid rather than fight. The money had been funneled through a management company that Paul Whitmore also owned, with most of it ultimately ending up in accounts controlled by the Whitmores and their partners. "This is a criminal enterprise," Patricia said, showing me the financial analysis she had put together. "They created a fake HOA specifically to steal property and extort money. This is textbook fraud, possibly racketeering." "Can we prove it?" I asked. "In a civil case, we only need to prove it by a preponderance of the evidence, meaning more likely than not." "I think we can do that. But for criminal charges, the DA needs to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. That is much harder." I forwarded everything to Michael Torres at the DA's office. He called me 2 days later. "This is good work," he said. "Really good. I am escalating to a formal investigation. I'm also bringing in the FBI because this might cross state lines, which makes it federal wire fraud. Some of these property owners lived out of state when they were targeted." "What does that mean for my case?" I asked. "Keep pursuing it. The civil case will probably resolve before any criminal case, and frankly, you will probably get your money back faster that way. But if we can bring criminal charges, it will help other victims and prevent the Whitmores from doing this to anyone else." The next few months were intense. Depositions happened where Patricia got to question Brenda, Paul, and the other HOA board members under oath. Brenda was defensive and evasive, constantly claiming she did not remember details or did not know what her husband was doing. Paul was smooth and practiced, insisting everything was legal and proper, just aggressive business practices in a competitive real estate market. But cracks started to show. One of the other board members, a guy named Robert, who was clearly not as sophisticated as Paul, admitted under questioning that Paul had specifically told him they were targeting properties where owners would not be able to respond quickly. He claimed Paul had said it was a smart strategy to maximize the HOA's revenue. That was the smoking gun we needed. Patricia filed a motion for summary judgment, asking Judge Morrison to rule in our favor without a trial based on the evidence we had presented. We had several hearings where Patricia laid out the entire scheme, showing how the HOA was created specifically to defraud property owners, how notices were sent in bad faith, how foreclosures were rushed, and how the money was funneled to the Whitmores. The HOA's lawyers tried to argue that everything was technically legal under North Carolina HOA law, but Judge Morrison was not buying it. "Counsel, I have reviewed the evidence," she said at the final hearing. "What your clients did may have superficially complied with HOA procedures, but it was done in bad faith with the intent to deprive property owners of their rights. The foreclosure against Staff Sergeant Warner was particularly egregious given his military service and the protections he was entitled to. I am granting summary judgment in favor of the plaintiff on all counts." I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I'd been carrying for almost a year. Judge Morrison was not done. "I am awarding Staff Sergeant Warner actual damages of $50,000 for the loss of use of his property, emotional distress, and the cost of retrieving his belongings. I am awarding punitive damages of $150,000 against both Mrs. Whitmore and the Mountain View Estates HOA, jointly and severally. I am also awarding attorney's fees and costs. Furthermore, I am issuing an injunction prohibiting the Mountain View Estates HOA from conducting any further foreclosures or assessments until they have properly notified all property owners and given them an opportunity to challenge the HOA's jurisdiction over their properties." Brenda started crying. Paul's face went white. Their lawyer looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. "Additionally," Judge Morrison continued, "I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of potential criminal violations. This court has seen enough evidence of fraudulent conduct that criminal authorities should review it." We walked out of the courthouse into bright sunshine. Patricia was grinning. "That is about as good as it gets in a civil case," she said. "200,000 in damages plus fees, and the injunction will probably kill their whole operation. Even if they appeal, they cannot keep foreclosing while the appeal is pending." "What are the chances they pay?" I asked. "Honestly, pretty good. If they do not pay, we can seize their assets, including properties they took from other people. They know that. They will probably try to negotiate a payment plan, but we will get our money." She was right. 2 weeks later, their lawyer contacted Patricia to propose a settlement. They would pay the full judgment amount over 12 months and dissolve the Mountain View Estates HOA entirely. In exchange, we would not pursue collection against their personal assets. Patricia advised me to take it. "You could push for everything immediately, but then they might declare bankruptcy and you will end up in a years-long fight. This way, you get paid, the HOA goes away, and other property owners can reclaim their land." I agreed. I had not done this for the money. I had done it because what they did was wrong. If other people could get their property back because the HOA was dissolving, that was worth more than squeezing every dollar out of the Whitmores. But the criminal case was just getting started. Michael Torres and an FBI agent named Jennifer Cruz came to my cabin to interview me in detail about everything that had happened. They told me the investigation had expanded to include not just the Mountain View Estates HOA, but also 2 other HOAs in different parts of North Carolina that Paul Whitmore had been involved in creating. The pattern was the same in all of them. Create an HOA, claim jurisdiction over properties without proper notice, assess fees, foreclose, and profit. "We are looking at wire fraud, mail fraud, potentially RICO charges if we can prove this was an organized criminal enterprise," Jennifer said. "But building a federal case takes time. We need to interview dozens of witnesses, trace financial records, prove interstate commerce connections. It is going to be at least another year before we can bring charges, if we bring them at all." "I understand," I said. "Whatever you need from me, I am here." The months that followed were strange. I finally had my cabin back, and the settlement payments from the Whitmores were coming in regularly. I used some of the money to restore the cabin to how it had been before Brenda redecorated it, and to make some improvements I had been planning before I deployed. I built a workshop in the back where I could do woodworking, something that helped quiet my mind after everything I had experienced overseas. I also started working with the other property owners who had been victimized by the HOA. With the injunction in place and the HOA dissolving, several of them were able to reclaim their properties or get refunds of the fees they had paid. Sarah got her parents' land back. The retired contractor got a refund of the $15,000 he had been forced to pay. Frank's nephew was able to repurchase his hunting cabin for the amount that had been owed in alleged HOA fees, which was way less than the property's actual value. It felt good to help people get some measure of justice, even if it could not undo all the harm that had been done. About 8 months after Judge Morrison's ruling, I got a call from Jennifer Cruz at the FBI. "We are making arrests tomorrow," she said. "I wanted to give you a heads up since you are one of the primary victims. Paul Whitmore, Brenda Whitmore, and 3 other individuals involved in the scheme are being charged with wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud. We are also seizing assets, including several properties they obtained through fraudulent foreclosures." "What kind of penalties are they looking at?" I asked. If convicted on all counts, Paul could face up to 30 years in federal prison. The others are looking at 10 to 20 years, depending on their level of involvement. These are serious charges. The arrests made the local news. I watched the footage of Paul and Brenda being led out of their house in handcuffs, and I felt a grim satisfaction. They had tried to steal from people who could not defend themselves, and now they would face consequences. The trial took place the following spring. I testified about what had happened to me, as did several other victims. The prosecution presented financial records showing how the scheme worked, emails where Paul discussed targeting absent property owners, and testimony from the board member who had admitted they were deliberately going after people who could not respond quickly. The defense tried to argue that everything was legal, HOA business, just aggressive practices in a competitive market. But the jury did not buy it. After 3 days of deliberation, they came back with guilty verdicts on all counts for Paul and Brenda. The other defendants were convicted on lesser charges. Paul Whitmore was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Brenda got 10 years, with credit for cooperation during the investigation. The others received sentences ranging from 3 to 7 years. Standing outside the courthouse after the sentencing, I talked to several of the other victims. Sarah was crying with relief. The retired contractor shook my hand and thanked me for not giving up the fight. "You could have just taken your settlement and walked away," he said, "but you kept pushing until they faced real consequences. That takes guts." "I just did what anyone should do when they see something wrong," I said. "I did not deploy overseas to defend our freedom just to come home and watch people abuse the legal system to steal from their neighbors." Michael Torres came over and congratulated me on the verdict. "This case is going to change how HOAs operate in North Carolina," he said. "The state legislature is already drafting new laws to prevent this kind of fraud. They are going to require HOAs to verify property owners' mailing addresses before foreclosing, to provide longer notice periods, and to notify military authorities before foreclosing on active duty service members. Your case made a real difference." I appreciated that, but mostly I was just glad it was over. The legal battles had consumed almost 2 years of my life, years I had hoped to spend readjusting to civilian life and finding peace in my mountain cabin. But in a way, fighting this fight had helped me transition. It had given me a mission, a sense of purpose beyond just surviving. I drove back up the mountain as the sun was setting, the same drive I had made that first day when I discovered a stranger living in my cabin. But this time, I knew my home was waiting for me, truly mine, with no clouds hanging over the title and no fraudulent HOA trying to steal it. I spent the evening on my porch, watching the stars come out over the mountains. The woods were quiet except for the sounds of night birds and the stream running through my property. This was what I had fought for, both overseas and here at home. The simple right to live in peace on land that belonged to me without someone trying to take it away. My phone buzzed with a text from my brother. He had been following the trial and wanted to know how I was doing. I texted back that I was good, really good for the first time in a long while. He asked if he could come visit soon, maybe do some fishing in my stream. I told him absolutely. It was time to start living again, to enjoy the things I had fought so hard to protect. Over the next few months, life settled into a rhythm. I started doing some consulting work for a private security company, using my special forces training to help them develop better protocols. It was part-time work that paid well and gave me something productive to do without the stress of full-time employment. I also started volunteering with a veterans organization that helped service members transitioning back to civilian life, particularly those dealing with legal or housing issues. I met someone too. Her name was Rachel Davis, and she worked as a park ranger in the Pisgah National Forest. We met at a community meeting about mountain conservation, and she impressed me immediately with her knowledge of the local ecosystem and her passion for protecting it. She was smart, funny, and had no patience for bureaucratic nonsense, which I appreciated. On our third date, I told her the whole story about the HOA and Brenda and the legal battle. I half expected her to think I was crazy or too much drama, but instead, she just shook her head in amazement. "You fought off a criminal organization and sent them to prison," she said. "That is incredible. Most people would have just given up." "I am not most people," I said. "Special forces training teaches you not to quit even when things look impossible." "I like that about you," she said, and kissed me. We took things slow, both of us having been burned in past relationships and not wanting to rush. But over time, Rachel became a fixture at my cabin. She loved the location almost as much as I did, and she had ideas about wildlife conservation projects we could do on my property. We built bat houses together and planted native flowers to support the local bee population. She taught me the names of all the birds that visited my property, and I taught her basic tactical skills for her ranger work. Life was good. Better than good, actually. I had my home, my freedom, someone special to share it with, and the satisfaction of knowing I had made a real difference in protecting other people from the kind of fraud I had experienced. One afternoon, about a year after the trial, I got a letter in the mail from Paul Whitmore. It had been forwarded from the federal prison where he was serving his sentence. I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me. The letter was handwritten, several pages long. In it, Paul apologized for what he had done. He claimed he had gotten caught up in making easy money and had rationalized away the harm he was causing. He said prison had given him time to think about his choices and the people he had hurt. He acknowledged that what he did to me was particularly wrong given my military service, and he said he hoped someday I could forgive him. I read the letter twice, then put it in a drawer. I did not feel particularly forgiving, but I also did not feel angry anymore. Paul was paying for his crimes, and his apology, whether sincere or not, did not change anything. What mattered was that the system had worked, eventually. Justice had been served, and other people were protected. Rachel found me on the porch later that evening, staring out at the mountains. "You okay?" she asked, sitting down next to me. "Yeah," I said. "Just thinking about how crazy the last few years have been. I went from combat deployments to fighting a legal war at home. It was not what I expected when I bought this place." "Would you change anything?" she asked. I thought about it. The easy answer was yes. I would change all of it. I would have made sure there was no way an HOA could claim jurisdiction over my property. I would have had better mail forwarding systems in place during my deployment. I would have avoided the stress, the expense, the anger of fighting that battle. But the truth was more complicated. "No," I said finally. "If it had not happened to me, it would have kept happening to other people. I had the resources and the skills to fight back. A lot of people do not. So maybe it was supposed to happen this way." Rachel leaned her head on my shoulder. "That's a very noble way to look at it. Or maybe I'm just trying to make sense of a bad situation," I said with a laugh. "Either way, it is over now. The Whitmores are in prison, the HOA is dissolved, and I finally get to just live my life." "I will drink to that," Rachel said, raising her beer bottle. We clinked bottles and watched the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The air was cool and clean, and somewhere in the woods, an owl called out. This was home. This was peace. And I had fought for every bit of it. The years that followed were some of the best of my life. Rachel and I got married in a small ceremony on my property, just family and close friends. We turned part of the land into a wildlife sanctuary, and Rachel used it for educational programs with local schools. I continued my consulting work and my volunteer work with veterans, finding fulfillment in helping others navigate the challenges I had faced. We had 2 kids, a boy and a girl, and raised them in the cabin that I had fought so hard to keep. I told them the story when they were old enough to understand, about how sometimes you have to stand up for what is right, even when it is hard, even when the system seems stacked against you. "Dad was a soldier," I explained to my son when he was about 10 years old and going through a phase where he wanted to hear all my military stories. But I learned that fighting for what is right does not stop when you take off the uniform. Sometimes the battles at home are just as important as the ones overseas. "Did you ever shoot anyone in the war?" he asked with the bluntness of a child. "That is not something we talk about," I said gently. "What matters is that I served my country and protected people who could not protect themselves. And when I came home, I kept doing that in a different way." He seemed to accept that answer, which was good because I did not have a better one. The cabin itself became something of a symbol in the community. When people heard the story of the HOA battle, they would sometimes drive up the mountain just to see the place where Lucas Warner had stood up to corruption and won. I never sought out that attention, but I did not mind it either. If my story inspired other people to fight back against injustice, that was a good thing. The laws in North Carolina did change because of what happened. The state legislature passed the Warner Act, which was named after me and provided additional protections for property owners against predatory HOA practices. It required verified mailing addresses before any enforcement action, mandatory long notice periods, and special protections for active duty military members that went beyond even federal law. Several other states adopted similar laws. I was invited to the state capitol to watch the governor sign the bill into law. Standing there in the legislative chamber, surrounded by other victims of HOA fraud and the legislators who had championed the reform, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. We had not just won our individual battles, we had changed the system to protect others. The retired contractor who had helped me early in the fight stood next to me, his eyes wet with tears. My daddy lost land to a scam like this back in the 1970s, he said quietly. There were no protections then, no recourse. He died bitter about it. I wish he could see this. He can, I said. Wherever he is, he knows we fixed it so it will not happen to others. Life has a way of coming full circle sometimes. Years after the trial, I ran into Brenda's grown daughter at a grocery store in Asheville. She recognized me and came over hesitantly, clearly not sure how I would react. "Mr. Warner," she said, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what my parents did to you. I was away at college when it all happened, and I had no idea what they were involved in. When I found out, I was horrified." "It is not your fault," I told her. "You did not do anything wrong." "I know, but they are my parents. My mom is getting out on parole next year, and she's going to need a lot of help readjusting. My dad still has 10 years left on his sentence. It has been really hard on the family." I felt sympathy for her despite everything. She was an innocent victim too, just in a different way. "I hope your mother gets the help she needs and makes better choices going forward. What they did was wrong, but they are still human beings who deserve a chance at redemption." She thanked me with tears in her eyes and hurried away. I told Rachel about the encounter later, and she said it showed how many lives had been affected by the Whitmores' fraud. It was not just the people they stole from. It was their own family, their partners, everyone connected to the scheme. "Do you think people can really change?" Rachel asked me that night. "I have seen people change in combat," I said. "Seen cowards become heroes and good people break under pressure. I think people are capable of change if they want it badly enough and have the right support. Whether the Whitmores can change, I do not know, but I hope so for their daughter's sake, if nothing else." As my kids grew older and I settled deeper into civilian life, I found myself thinking less about the HOA battle and more about the future. My son showed an interest in the military, which both scared and pleased me. I told him about the honor and purpose I had found in service, but also the costs. I made sure he understood that military service was not a game or an adventure, but a serious commitment that would change him forever. My daughter was more interested in environmental science, inspired by Rachel's work. She wanted to study conservation biology and help protect wild spaces. I supported that completely, happy that my fight to keep our land had given her a place to develop that passion. The cabin itself aged well, growing more beautiful with time as the wood weathered and the gardens Rachel planted matured. We added a workshop for me, a greenhouse for Rachel, and a treehouse for the kids. Every improvement felt like a victory, a way of claiming the space more completely as ours. Sometimes, late at night when I could not sleep, I would walk my property line under the stars. 3 acres was not much in the grand scheme of things, just a tiny piece of the vast mountain wilderness that surrounded us. But it was mine. I had bought it honorably, defended it legally, and earned the right to pass it on to my children. That mattered more than I could put into words. There were still hard days, times when my combat experience came back to haunt me, when loud noises made me flinch or crowds made me anxious. Rachel understood those struggles and gave me space when I needed it, support when I asked for it. The cabin was my sanctuary not just from the HOA fraud, but from all the demons I had brought back from war. This land had healed me in ways I had not expected. One evening, about 5 years after the trial, I got a call from Jennifer Cruz, the FBI agent who had worked the case. She had moved on to a different field office but still kept in touch occasionally. "I thought you would want to know," she said. "We just closed another case based on the investigative techniques we developed during your case. Another fake HOA scheme in Tennessee. Caught them early this time before they could victimize as many people. Your case gave us a blueprint for how these frauds work." "That is good to hear," I said. "How many people did they hurt?" "Only 3 foreclosures before we shut them down, compared to 14 in your case. We are getting better at identifying these schemes early. And prosecutors around the country are taking HOA fraud more seriously now. You really did make a difference, Lucas." After we hung up, I felt that same sense of satisfaction I had felt at the Capitol. The fight had been worth it, not just for me, but for all the people who would not become victims because of what we had exposed and the changes we had forced. I shared the news with Rachel and the kids over dinner. My son, now a teenager, asked if I would do it all again, knowing how hard it would be. "Absolutely," I said without hesitation. "Standing up for what is right is not supposed to be easy. If it were easy, everyone would do it, but it is necessary, especially when you have the ability to fight back. A lot of people do not have that ability, so those of us who do have a responsibility to use it. My daughter, always the practical one, asked if we were finally safe from anyone trying to take our land again. No one is ever completely safe from people who want to abuse the system, I told her honestly. But we have the deed, we know our rights, and we know how to fight if we need to. Plus, the laws are better now. It would be much harder for someone to pull what the Whitmores did. But you would fight again if you had to, she said. It was not a question. Yes, I said. I would always fight to protect our home and our family. That is what soldiers do, whether we are wearing a uniform or not. The conversation moved on to other topics, school and sports and the usual family dinner talk. But later, after the kids were in bed, Rachel and I sat on the porch in our usual spots, looking out at the mountains in the twilight. "Do you think they understand?" she asked. "The kids, I mean. Do you think they get why you fought so hard?" "They will," I said. "Maybe not now, but someday when they have something worth fighting for, they will remember. They will know that their dad did not just talk about principles. He lived them." Rachel took my hand and squeezed it. "I am proud of you. I know I do not say it enough, but I am. A lot of men would have just walked away, found somewhere else to live, avoided the hassle. You did not do that. You stood your ground." "This is my ground to stand on," I said simply. "I bought it, I earned it, and no one had the right to take it. That is worth fighting for." We sat in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the sky and the stars began to appear. An owl called from the woods, that same sound I had heard years ago on another night when I was trying to make sense of everything that had happened. But now there was nothing to make sense of. Life was good. Life was right. I had served my country overseas, defended my home here, raised a family, and made a difference in the world. Not everyone gets to say that. I am one of the lucky ones. The story of HOA Karren moving into my cabin while I was deployed and not knowing I was Special Forces became something of a legend in our area. People told it as a cautionary tale about not trying to take advantage of military members or as an inspirational story about standing up to corruption. I did not mind either version. The truth was both of those things and more. What I learned from the whole experience was that the battles we fight at home can be just as important as the battles we fight overseas. Freedom is not just about defending our country from foreign enemies, it is about defending our rights from domestic threats too. It is about making sure that systems of justice actually work for everyone, not just for those with money or connections or the willingness to abuse legal technicalities. The cabin still stands on its 3 acres of mountain land. Rachel and I plan to live here for the rest of our lives, and we have already worked out an estate plan to pass it on to our children when we are gone. The deed is secure, properly recorded, with all the legal protections in place. No one will ever take this land through fraud or deception again. On the anniversary of Judge Morrison's ruling, I sometimes raise a glass to all the people who helped me fight that battle. Patricia Hughes, who took my case when other lawyers would not. Michael Torres and Jennifer Cruz, who pursued criminal charges when they could have just let it be a civil matter. Judge Morrison herself, who saw through the legal technicalities to the injustice underneath. And all the other victims who shared their stories and helped build the case that brought the Whitmores down. But mostly I think about what this place means. It is more than just a cabin and some land. It is proof that ordinary people can fight back against powerful interests and win. It is proof that the legal system, for all its flaws, can still deliver justice if you are persistent enough and have the courage to stand up for yourself. I deployed overseas to defend American freedoms and values. I came home and had to deploy again in a different way, fighting a legal battle to defend those same principles on my own property. Both fights were worth it. Both fights mattered, and both fights taught me that being a soldier is not just about wearing a uniform. It is about having the courage to stand up for what is right, no matter what form that battle takes. The mountains stand eternal, indifferent to human struggles and conflicts. The stream that runs through my property has flowed for thousands of years and will flow for thousands more. The land itself does not care who owns it or what battles are fought over it. But I care, and that is what makes it worth fighting for. This is my home, this is my ground, and no one will ever take it from me again.